Hey everyone, how's it going? God Gamer here. Today I want to tell you the history of the Hollow Knight Explosion Pogo trick in speedruns. This is one of the most interesting tricks in Hollow Knight speedrunning, not only because of how cool it is to begin with, but because of how it's advanced and evolved over time. It was also found just a few months after the game released, and its difficulty was relatively high compared to other speedrunning tricks. And over time, as people became more and more hungry for small time saves in the run, it just became more and more optimized. There's actually so many variations of this trick, way more than you would ever expect. So this was discovered by Moglar 5K. It happened on May 30th, 2017, just about 3.5 months after the game released. And you might know about Moglar 5K from my first God Gamers video. This guy discovered acid skips, he discovered the any percent NMG Isthmus tier route, and he discovered this, the explosion pogo. So what you do is you take this enemy here who shoots an explosive projectile, and then you lure it to a specific spot where you can pogo off of it. Now this projectile explodes after a certain amount of time has passed, and when it does explode, you can actually pogo off of the explosion hitbox afterward and get all the way up here, performing a skip that saves 20 seconds. And I'm gonna put this in slow motion, but you just pogo off of this explosive projectile. Then when the explosion happens, you pogo off of that as well. Then you simply dash up into the room transition. It's a really, really cool trick, and the reason why it's so important is because every speedrun needs to get Mantis Claw in order to beat the game. And you normally get down to this room, with the objective being to get here where Mantis Claw is located. Now, before we knew about Explosion Pogo, we had to take this path through these rooms to get to the room with Mantis Claw. However, with Explosion Pogo, you simply get up to this transition and then drop straight down into the room with wall jump. Now, I don't want to get too much into the history, but back in my day, I had an any percent NMG time of 44 minutes. So when this guy found Explosion Pogo, I was like, no way, man, that's going to be way too hard for me. And even though Queen's Garden's acid skip had been discovered at that point, we decided that it was too hard to do. We're not doing Queen's Garden's acid skip, and Explosion Pogo might be too hard for us to implement. But as you can see, players immediately had the idea to mix in a damage tank to make the trick easier. So we immediately had our first evolution of the trick. And what this is the Ouipogo damage tank strategy. This was found almost immediately after the Ouipogo was found, almost on accident, because if you don't do the Ouipogo properly, you'll end up taking damage. And taking damage gives you more height, which makes reaching this transition much easier. Now, all you do for the damage tank strat is you just pogo off of it, and because you're to the left of the projectile that's exploding, you get knocked back to the left as well. And you can see when you take knockback, it knocks you just far enough left so you clear this little part of the ceiling, and you can pogo off of the explosion afterwards, and you have so much height to easily dash to the left and get into the next room. Now, doing the trick this way did lose time, because whenever you take damage, you have freeze frames, which automatically lose you time by default. However, it made the trick extremely easy to consistently pull off. So in 2017, when runners weren't as experienced as they are now, it was a great way to just make the trick completely free. In fact, personally, I used the trick until 2019. A lot of runners bullied me for using the easier version of the trick, but whenever I watched them stream and miss the pogo, I was the one who was laughing. Now, over time, people refined the way they pulled off the trick and made use of a lot of visual and audio cues in order to make it more consistent. And the reason why these audio and visual cues are so important is because your movement needs to be consistently the exact same every time. Otherwise, the projectile is going to end up in a slightly different spot, and you're going to have to react to where the projectile is. Personally, what I would always do is dash as soon as I heard the sporg shoot its projectile. I would fall to the ground in this location every time, and as soon as the sporg crossed this line in the background, I would jump and do the pogos. And as soon as I pulled off the first pogo, I would start holding left and do another pogo as soon as possible. Using really consistent movement like this made the trick much easier to pull off, and most players opted to use this standard normal version of the Ouipogo. Another version of the trick was also discovered, which would eventually be used for low percent speedruns. Low percent speedruns are noteworthy because they do not get dash, but they still require Mantis Claw to beat the game. So because you don't have dash, you can't simply rely on getting up to this point in the top left and then dashing. You have to start your pogos from closer to the wall so you can simply hold left and get up to this platform. So personally, I would use the same audio cue of dashing into the wall when I heard the projectile get shot, but then as soon as I saw the sporg enter the top of the screen, I would walk left to this mushroom. From that point, you can just jump straight up and pogo the explosion twice. You're actually too far left to pogo the sporg itself, but with the right timing, the explosion can be pogoed twice, just like this. Although this was mostly used for low percent, this was a setup that some people used for any percent as well with dash, just mainly if they weren't comfortable with the regular version of Ouipogo. Now personally, in 2019, I was trying to find a lot of ways to optimize the any percent NMG run, and I decided it was finally time to stop doing damage tank Ouipogo. I wanted to save time with the trick, and I thought that there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate the sporg, so maybe there's different ways to do this trick even faster. The first trick that I came up with takes advantage of a special property of the projectile that the sporg shoots. Once the projectile gets close to exploding, it actually slows down significantly. If you hit the sporg with your nail during this time, it'll explode. Typically when people do explosion pogo, they pogo it before it slows down and then after it explodes. But what if you slashed the projectile when it was at its highest at this point right down here, took knockback, and then pogoed the explosion and dashed right to the left? It should theoretically save time because the sporg doesn't have to travel as far down before you pogo it. However, in order to get it to that exact spot, as well as get yourself into the right position too, to be able to slash it, you have to do some tricky movement. So let me just show you this clip. Now I'm going to show this again in slow motion and kind of break it down. So the first thing you do is you drop down and you want to go immediately as far left as you can. And the reason for that is you want to get all the way up here in order to slash the projectile and get knocked back to the left. And in order to get up to this point, you have to pogo off of these mushrooms over here and then dash to the left. Now, if you just fell straight down like with the normal setup and then pogoed off the mushrooms and dashed to the left, guess where the projectile is going to be? It's going to be like right down here. It's going to be way too far to the right in order to hit. So you lure it to the left to start with to compensate for the fact that you're going to move to the right afterward. So let's just watch this all in slow motion and try to keep in mind where the spore is, even though it's off screen. You can see it's already starting to move to the right, but it's still going to be in range for me to turn around and hit it right after this dash. After the explosion, you simply hold right and then perform the pogo. This saved about 0.3 to 0.4 seconds on the regular strat. However, compared to what I was doing before, which was the regular damage tank strat, it saved about 0.8. So it was a pretty considerable time save at that point in the speedrun. However, there's actually another way that you can explode this projectile, and this method allows you to explode the projectile even earlier. You can do so with a fireball, and if you choose to do this strat with a fireball, it means you're not taking any damage. Not taking damage means no freeze frames. So this is the fastest possible way to do explosion pogo. And what I found when I was optimizing this strat was that you can actually hit this sporg twice. Normally it wouldn't save as much time because you would have to collect soul in the other rooms. But the fact that you can hit the sporg twice means you don't have to collect as much soul in order to do this strat. After you perform the second hit, you simply move into this wall and inventory drop down to the ground. And once we get to the ground, we just want to pogo these mushrooms quickly and then dash directly under this ceiling, turn around, fireball, and then just pogo the explosion. So this is definitely one of the coolest discoveries that I think I've made in the any percent speedrun. It's just really satisfying to pull off. The problem is that it's actually really difficult. So for the longest time, people didn't consider this run viable. In fact, the slash damage tank strat, which I began using right away, was actually only used by me. To my knowledge, no other runners used the strat, even though it saved decent time. And personally, even though I did use the slash damage tank strat, I didn't have full confidence with it all the time. Sometimes if I started getting nervous, like if I was on a good pace, I would revert back to the old standard Ouipogo strat just to be safe. So it was a good thing that someone found a version of the strat that was easier, but saved the same amount of time. So on April of next year in 2020, the Ouipogo was found by Murray. This was another damage tank strat, but instead of using a nail slash to explode the projectile, you dashed into it to explode it. That's because, surprise, surprise, if you touch the projectile, it explodes. So the movement Murray used to set this up is dashing off to the left after the spore gets shot, and then dashing again once he reaches the bottom of this wall. Afterward, he just holds left until he gets to the mushroom and then dashes to the right and immediately pogos the mushrooms, dashes to the left into the projectile. That results in the explosion, which knocks you back to the left. Then you can pogo the explosion immediately after and continue on. Let's just watch this again in full speed. And this strat is actually just as fast as the slash damage tank strat that I found, but it's considerably easier to pull off consistently. Now, for some time after this was found, a lot of people just stuck to the standard Ouipogo strat, but once top players started to get really thirsty for those small time saves, this was the strat that most implemented first. You will see some top players using Fireball Pogo. However, that is definitely a very difficult skip to pull off in a run, and it only saves about 0.1 to 0.2 on this version of the skip. To me, it's just super cool that there's so many variations on this skip, but so far I've only talked about patch 1.2.2.1. Now, for those who don't know, the majority of any % no major glitches speedruns are run on patch 1.2.2.1. However, there are a lot of what is called latest patch speedruns. And what we're really talking about is when people were playing patch 1.4.3.2 and also now patch 1.5.7.8, now that that's out too. One major difference with these later patches is this. You can see if you pogo the explosion, nothing happens. In other words, Team Cherry patched out the explosion pogo. Now, it's not clear if they intentionally patched this out on purpose because they saw speedrunners doing it and wanted to take away their fun. However, many speedrunners did interpret it that way, but regardless of why Team Cherry did it, Explosion Pogo was not the same on later patches. However, Explosion Pogo was actually still possible on later patches, and the way players did it was not how you'd expect. Yes, we had to open our menu and turn on VSync. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is that knockback in Hollow Knight is based off of your FPS. So if you have a lower FPS, you get knocked back for more time for some reason. Being knocked back for more time means you get knocked back further the lower your FPS is. Now, in Hollow Knight speedruns, changing your FPS mid-run through external software is not allowed. So you couldn't, for example, jump into an enemy and turn your FPS to 1 and get knocked back into a different room. However, changing your FPS by turning on VSync is allowed. VSync is a setting that will limit the game's frame rate to the refresh rate of the monitor that you're using. Now, typically we want the game to run at a high FPS because otherwise the game's gonna run like ass. There's just a lot of performance issues that happen when the game's running at lower FPS values. But if you just need lower FPS for one trick, you can play at a higher FPS, then lower it down to 60 by turning on VSync and get the extra knockback in order to pull off Ouipogo. Once you're done with Ouipogo, you just turn VSync back off and you're back to the frame rate that you were at. And this is what it looks like to pull off the trick. You just pogo it once as high as possible and take damage as high as you can, and then you can just barely dash up onto this platform. There were two main problems with this. First off, it was still extremely hard to pull off. So oftentimes you'd spend all this time opening the menu and setting this up, and you just wouldn't get the trick. You'd have to turn VSync back off and then just go around the long way. Secondly, if you have a monitor that can show more frames per second than 60, you'd actually have to limit your monitor's refresh rate to 60 instead of 144 or 160 or whatever you could show normally. That means you're not getting any of the benefit out of your super expensive gaming monitor. And if you're speedrunning, being able to see those frames really matters. So this trick was originally found, I believe, by a person named Seppuku17. But personally, I would have been happy if this person never found it, because having to do this trick in a 112% run was really not very fun. However, as speedrunners are known to do, we found a variation of the trick. In July of 2019, a player named Panta found a way to pogo off of the sporg a single time and make it up to the platform. And he did so without lowering his FPS or even damage tanking at all. The idea was to lure the projectile to the left, kind of like with the slash damage tank strat, and then simply pogo off of it afterward. But the difficulty is that getting the sporg far enough to the left to pogo off of it and make it to the platform on the left is actually very, very difficult to pull off. The difficulty level was actually so high that a lot of players stuck to the old crappy VSync strat. But let's just take a look at this movement. You simply walk off the platform normally, then you hang out at this mushroom for a second, and then you book it over to the mushroom to pogo off of, and you want to be able to get enough height to get above the projectile and pogo off of it before it reaches the state where pogoing it will result in an explosion, and it just looks like this. Now you can see it's extremely tight to pull off. And let's just look at all the things that are so close to going wrong. First of all, this sporg is extremely close to hitting the wall. If it hits the wall, it will bounce off of the wall and end up in a weird spot. Secondly, when I pogo up here, you can see I'm almost hitting this ceiling. If I bonk into this ceiling, I am not going to make it up to this platform. Next, you can see the height I'm dashing at is not above this platform. The only reason why I can dash onto this platform is because of something called height correction. Height correction happens when you dash and you're not quite high enough to make it onto the platform, so the game just gives you a freebie and lets you on anyway. I'm just gonna let you watch this once again so you can see what happens right here. The game just bumps you up a little bit, even though you shouldn't have been quite high enough to make it up. The difficulty of this Ouipogo was very high. However, it was still really nice that this version was found because it gave an alternative for the really skilled players to not have to rely on the VSync Epogo. However, earlier last year, there was an easier and more consistent version that was found for current patch. Now, from my understanding, this was discovered kind of as a team effort by Shai and Mthulu, and the idea is that you're manipulating the movement of the projectile by fireball stalling in the air in precise spots, and basically you just want to get the projectile down to this point over here, and you pogo off of it, and you get into the next room. Now, this is the 2 fireball variant, and you essentially just wait until it's right above your head, dash into the wall, hold right, and you fireball right below the ceiling. As soon as the fireball ends, you dash left, and you fireball again to the left, and that brings the projectile with the perfect arc for you to pogo off of it and get into the next room. Now, the problem here is that if you don't lure this projectile perfectly, it's going to be just a little bit too far away, and then at this point you just have nothing to pogo, so you fall down to the ground. Now, if you practice this trick enough, you can of course do it consistently, but it is considered a fairly difficult version of Ouipogo. So this is a version that requires 3 fireballs instead of 2, so you do have to farm extra soul before getting to this room, and because of that, you lose a bit of time to do this strat. However, it's much more lenient. Basically, the movement's the same, but you dash up here a little bit earlier, and then you fireball once here, and you dash to the left and do 2 fireballs instead of 1. I'm gonna play this at full speed just so you can see what it actually looks like. And that's just such a cool and satisfying strat to pull off. So we do call it Ouipogo still, even though on current patch, it's no longer an explosion pogo. You literally cannot pogo the explosion anymore, but just for the sake of consistency, we continue to call it that. And to my knowledge, that is all the versions of explosion pogo that exist. I just love these tricks because they're so fun to pull off, and the aspect of discovery within the community just brings so much excitement to the speedrun. When you wake up one day and someone's discovered a new version of Ouipogo, it's just so cool to want to open up the game and try it out. It's just one of the things I love most about speedrunning. And for a lot of viewers, that's not an experience that you get to know about. So I'm hoping that showing you all of this and telling you about all my experiences with these strats kind of gives you an idea of what goes into these speedruns, because this is just one trick in one room of the game. But I hope you found the video interesting and you have a wonderful day. Peace.